if you're wondering why it is that those three Bible passages that we read this morning are all readings that we've had here at church over the last probably couple of years. One of them, Acts 1, only just about 2 months ago. It's because we're starting a series this morning for just 3 weeks, a more topical theological series on the ascension. And so we're going to be looking at those texts, but kind of in a different way than we would have looked at them when we were just working our way through the first few chapters of the book of Acts or the letter to the Colossians, that last little reading that we had. And then over the next 2 weeks, we'll look at some other passages in the Bible as well, including some of the letter to the Hebrews and Ephesians. We'll get there over the coming weeks. Now, I'm what you might call a substitute preacher this morning, in that I wasn't meant to be preaching. Andrew Cadday, the senior minister of Christ Church in the West, who I work with, he was going to be here, but Simon Elliott, who's the Drummoyne site pastor, is so sick this week that he couldn't preach, and so Andrew's preaching at Drummoyne, and I got punted a sermon on Friday, which means there's going to be just a little bit more of other people's voices in this week's sermon than normal. You'll hear a little bit more of Andrew's stuff. So if it sounds a little bit like Andrew at points, then you can forgive me. All right, here we go. My father was a pharmacist in Hungary after the Second World. I'm just messing with you. I'm not going to go all like that. That's actually not how he starts, and all right, the ascension. We spoke about it just a few minutes ago, actually, when we said the words of the Apostles' Creed. We said that Jesus ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father, and from there he will come to judge the living and the dead. Now, I don't know what you make of the ascension. I think in some ways it's one of the harder things to explain in the Christian story. It's sort of easy enough to get, although it's still miraculous and mysterious, that God, the eternal God from all creation, might take on human flesh in the incarnation and be born in a stable in Bethlehem as the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're so familiar with the story of his death on a Roman cross and then his rising on the third day to life. But this part of the story, that 40 days after his resurrection, he ascends back to heaven, well, that's just a little weird and a little hard to work out what is going on there. It seems to play right into the doubts that we might have. And if you're here this morning and you're a bit skeptical about Christianity, you're not sure whether you believe it or not, you're just kind of wondering, well, maybe it plays into those doubts about the gospel narratives. How could this be true? How convenient it is that this supposedly risen Messiah, the one whom God sent to make his salvation known, should just vanish away from the earth without having shown himself to anyone other than his friends and family. And yet, here's the thing, Jesus seemed to think that his ascension was pretty important. On the day that he rose from the dead, Mary went to the tomb to meet Jesus. She was wondering what had happened because there was no body there, and she went looking for the body of Jesus, and she met the risen Jesus, and she grasps onto him, and Jesus says to her, "Mary, do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. I've still got a job to do. I can't stay here with you." See, for Jesus, the ascension wasn't superfluous to his mission, it was essential. And as we start to grapple with this and try and get our heads around it, we've also got to grapple with this question of the presence and absence of Jesus. Is Jesus present or is he absent? And if he's absent, then how might he also at the same time in some way be present. He says in John chapter 14, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. And then he says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. Would I have told you that I go there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, you also may be. He seems to think that he has to go somewhere. But then in Matthew 28, he tells his disciples that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, and therefore they should go and make disciples, baptizing them in his name and teaching them to obey everything he's commanded. And then he makes this promise. He says, and surely I am with you till the end of the age. And so where is Jesus? Is he present? Is he absent? Can he be both present and absent? What's he doing now as the ascended one? And what does this mean for us, for the church and for the world? These are the questions that we're addressing in this series. And so today's the introductory week, and we look at this topic of the ascended Jesus and God. 3 points. You'll see them here on a slide. Number 1, what is the ascension? Number 2, what does the ascension mean for God? And number 3, what does the ascension mean for us? So number 1, what is the ascension? Well, the ascension is mentioned in all of the Gospels, but it's only narrated for us in Luke's Gospel, and then also at the beginning of the book of Acts. Luke wrote both of those 2 volumes. Acts chapter 1, verse 9, Luke says, when he had said this, that's Jesus, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. As I said, we looked at this passage a couple of months back, so we're not going to go into it in all the same depth, but let me refresh you as to what's happening in this moment. So you might be envisaging a kind of Christian kitsch image of a blonde Jesus half disappearing behind pastel-coloured clouds. And he's playing a game of cosmic hide and seek. He's just sort of up there behind the clouds. And eventually he'll poke his head out and say, here I am. But that's not what's going on at all. If we want to understand what the ascension is, we have to clear up what the ascension isn't. See, it's not so much about him going into the heavens, that is the skies above, but rather going into heaven, capital H. And there's a difference. In 1961, the Soviet Union put a cosmonaut into space, the first man ever to make it into space. And they reported that man had ascended into the heavens and they didn't see God there, and therefore God didn't exist. Do you see a picture on your screen there? That's just a blank one, isn't it? Okay. There was a picture of the poster, like a communist poster, which shows all of this happening. That's okay. You don't need to see it. They put a man in the moon, and they said, we went to the moon. Oh, sorry, not to the moon. They put a man in space. They went up into space, and they said, we didn't see God in outer space. Now, one of the possible Christian responses that you could have made in that moment was to say, well, you didn't go far enough. You went into space. You should have gone into outer space. If you're going to be in the galaxy, if you're going to be in the universe, then maybe you would have found him there. And that's kind of tempting to make, but it's not, I don't think, a very helpful way to try and make the argument. C.S. Lewis, amongst others, they made a different case. They put it this way. Here's Lewis. He says, in an essay he calls this called The Seeing Eye, he says, the Russians, I'm told, report that they have not found God in outer space. On the other hand, a good many people in many different times and countries claim to have found God or have been found by God here on earth. Looking for God or heaven by exploring space is like reading or seeing all Shakespeare's plays in the hope that you will find Shakespeare as one of the characters or Stratford as one of the places. If God does exist, he is related to the universe more as an author is related to a play than as one object in the universe is related to another. If God exists, Mere movement in space will never bring you any nearer to him or farther from him than you are at this very moment. You can neither reach him nor avoid him that sounds weird. You can neither reach him nor avoid him by traveling to Alpha Centauri or even to other galaxies. A fish is no more and no less in the sea after it has swum 1,000 miles than when it set out. See, Lewis is saying, you don't get God by crossing geographical space. It's not just that he's out there somewhere, and if you could just pilot a rocket ship far enough, you could get to him. And no, God's like an author of a play, like Shakespeare is to his characters. His dimensionality is different. The ascension isn't a change in altitude, and something far more profound is happening. And Lewis speaks of this in another essay where he says that we live as three-dimensional beings in four-dimensional reality. You've got to kind of get your head around this for a minute. And by that fourth dimension, he wasn't making claims about physics or about the possibility of other created dimensions. What he meant was that there is a heavenly dimension, a heavenly realm where God is and where his presence is unmediated glory. So that when Jesus ascends, what he does is he moves from humanity's space to God's space. And the point is that heaven is not so much a geographical location, but a place where God dwells, the place where humans do not dwell. It belongs to God alone. Human beings can't access it except one human being who has accessed it, Jesus Christ, the resurrected Lord of all. And you can take this analogy one step further. Now let's go from being 3 and 4 dimensional to being 2 and 3 dimensional for a minute. So imagine just for a moment that you were a 2-dimensional being. I've got a little image for you here. Think Super Mario World, circa 1990. There it is. I had to enlarge the image and I thought it was going to pixelate it, but then I realized it's already pixelated. There's a horizontal plane with an x-axis and a y-axis. Height and width, but no depth. But then, what if a 3-dimensional character entered this 2-dimensional world? You'll see it here. To you, if you were a 2-dimensional character in a 2-dimensional world, this 3-dimensional character would just appear in 2 dimensions. It would show up as a 2D set of dots. And only when it crossed into your horizontal plane. It would still have the ability to move along its z-axis, its depth axis, and when it did, it would disappear from your view. It might be on your x and y coordinates. It might be exactly in line with where you are, but because it's traveled in depth and you're 2-dimensional and it's 3-dimensional, you can't see it. You can't know where it is. Now, it's a limited analogy. It's not perfect. But it's one of the ways that we try and communicate what it means and how it can be that God can be present even though we don't see him. Because God dwells in heaven. But heaven isn't somewhere out there. Heaven is like a dimensionality, a spiritual realm that is his space. It's more of a dimensional space than like a geographical space. And so when Jesus ascends, he goes with his body into God's realm. And that's fundamentally important for the meaning of the ascension, including what it means for God, which is point 2. What does the ascension mean for God? Well, in a nutshell, it means this: God's plan has been achieved. What God intended for the world, what God was wanting to bring about in the world, he has successfully done so. Salvation has been won. It's kind of like a little full stop on God's plan of redemption. Now, how can that be the case? Well, you can think about the ways that we use the word ascend. You can use the word ascend in a literal sense, but you can also mean it in a metaphorical sense. And so we use the word ascend to talk about going up, like you might ascend in an elevator from one floor to another floor. But we can also use the word ascend to speak about increasing in power or authority, like our phrase to rise through the ranks or ascend the ranks. And you can take, for example, the recent coronation of King Charles in England. In the coronation service, if you watched it, keep that one away, there was a literal throne. I'm messing with Robin at the back here, I'm sorry, Robin. There was a literal throne, the coronation chair, the throne of St. Edward, that's been used in English coronations since the 13th century. And now if you and I, say we could go to Westminster Abbey, right? Just imagine that you were in Westminster Abbey and the security guards were not watching and you just decided you were going to go and sit in King Edward's coronation chair. It's up a few steps, you'd have to ascend to get there. And so you could literally ascend to the throne. And you could sit in the seat. But just going up the stairs and sitting in the seat doesn't make you the king or queen of England and the Commonwealth realms. And actually what Charles did when he became king at his coronation was far more than just taking a few steps up to the throne. It was an ascension physically, yes, but the physical act was a representation of something far more significant and profound. In ascending to the throne, his relationship to his people changed. And he took on a new and immense authority and responsibility. And the same is true of Jesus' ascension. The biblical story says that he went up. And there's I think a truth in that in a physical sense, but actually the physical is pointing to the meaning behind it, which was that this was a moment of coronation. This was a moment of Jesus becoming king. His relationship to the world changes. Now, of course, the Son of God, God the Son, second person of the Trinity, has always been the one who reigns over creation. It's never the case that God hasn't been on the throne. But here's how Jesus' ascension connects to the completion of God's work in salvation. Now it's a human being who sits on the throne in heaven. And that's new. The Son of God descended. He came down for us and for our salvation. He became truly human, flesh and blood, just like you and me. And Jesus, with that same flesh and blood, has ascended back into heaven to the right hand of the Father. There is now a human in heaven, body and all. One of us is in glory at the right hand of the Father, and he reigns. And this is what God had always planned. This was his intention for humanity to rule with him, for humanity to rule with God over creation. And from the beginning, the purpose and plan of God was to make a world full of life and peace and joy, creatures that would fill the earth, beautiful spaces everywhere. And then for his image bearers, that's humanity, to have dominion over it. And another word for dominion is the word Lord, to lord it over. God's plan has always been to have humans as lords over creation for its flourishing. And so the ascension is the next great big step in the plan, which says sin will not win. It's God saying, you are not going to rob me of my creation. You are not going to interfere with what I'm trying to do. You will not stop my purposes. This is my world. And this is my image bearer, my human being who is going to rule over the creation for its good. And so when Jesus ascends, it's the climax of the whole story of salvation. A human being is Lord in heaven. And so then you've got to ask the question, so what does that mean for us? If God's always been the ruler, if God's always been king, but now the God-man, fully God, fully human, the Lord Jesus Christ is Lord in heaven, what does that mean for us? And for that we need to go to Colossians chapter 3. Our last little reading, a few verses. Listen to what Paul writes to this church, these young believers in Colossae. He says to them, "So, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory." Now notice that the theme of this passage is the ascension. Paul says, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. But notice also that Paul draws out an implication from that reality for you and me. He writes, if then you have been raised with Christ. And that word if in the New Testament often means since or because, and that's the case here. You could translate it a little bit stronger. It doesn't mean if as in maybe, it means because you have been raised with Christ. If you trust in him, then you have been raised with Christ, not yet in a body, but raised spiritually in him when you took on the new life that comes through faith in him. And the concept here is what theologians, those who study Christian doctrine, call union with Christ. And the point is that Jesus' story is intimately connected to our story. What's true of him becomes true of us. And so just as Jesus died, those who put their trust in him die to their old selves. And just as Jesus was raised from the dead on the third day, so those of us who have our faith in him have been raised spiritually in him to be raised in new resurrection bodies on the last day, but to already have the new life at work inside us now. But then he goes on one step forward, a thing which we might not often think through, which is that just as he is above at the right hand of God in heaven, so by virtue of our union with Christ, that's where we are too. Your life, Paul says, is hidden with Christ in God. Christ's ascension is your ascension. You can think about it a little bit like a sports team. There's lots of good sport on recently. Women's Football World Cup, the Ashes, Wimbledon, the Tour. List goes on. But for this one, who's watched Ted Lasso? You get a bit of a... Yep, okay. Some of the best characters in the show, I think, are these guys here. Pretty minor characters in the whole thing, but they're the fans, right? The fans who live and breathe the wins and defeats of AFC Richmond. When their team loses, they're devastated. When their team wins, they're elated. And like all true sports fans, they see themselves as part of the team. They say, "We won," when Richmond wins a game, or "We lost" when they lose. They're part of what the team does on the pitch, and they experience it with them. Of course, none of them play for the fictional Richmond AFC team, just as none of us play for the Matildas or the Sydney Swans, or take your pick. But we say, "We won." And something like that on a much deeper, much more real level happens to us and Jesus. Jesus wins. And because he wins, we win too. In him, our sins were carried to death. In him, we've conquered the grave. And one of us from Team Humanity, one of us is in heaven, reigning with God the Father. And Paul says, since that's the case, since your representative is in heaven, then also you should seek the things that are above. That word seek is a Greek word, zelos, from which we get our word zeal. And zeal's the way that when your team gets a wicket or scores a goal, you feel elated. You pump your fist with passion. It's a word to do with the heart. Zeal is something that you do in your heart. And because Jesus has ascended, and you with him, you zealously seek the things that are above. You're devoted to the things that are above. And Paul also says you set your minds on the things that are above. He doesn't mean up in a spatial sense, but the higher, nobler things that are associated with the heavenly dimension of God's glory. You've set your hope, you set your life on Christ. And we didn't read these verses that come later in Colossians, but when you seek the things above with your heart and set your minds on them also, Paul says that this will start to change your life. He says you'll stop doing some things. You'll put to death the things that are of your flesh: impurity, fornication, lust, idolatry, greed, malice, and slander. And he says instead you'll put on some things. You'll clothe yourselves with good things, the good things of Jesus, like humility, compassion, kindness, gentleness, and above all, love. And the most amazing part of all of this is something else that the apostle says. He says, your life is hidden with Christ in God. And what that means is that what's most true about you, most real about you, is hidden now. But it's no less true. Think about your life. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. From dust to dust, it's fragile, limited, often selfish, plenty of the time pretty mundane, doing some good things, some not so good things. Is this our life? Is this all we really are? Is this our destiny individually and as a species? And Paul says, no, that's not your destiny. That's not where you're headed. What's true about your life is that it's hidden. It's not obvious, it can't be seen, but it will be. You will be, verse 4, when Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. And he's saying the awesome, beautiful, powerful, wonderful, glorious you, the you that you actually are in Christ, will be revealed. Right now, it's hidden. You might look at me and you might think, there's a guy whose hair fell out too soon, who thinks he's funnier than he is, and who looks like he's come off second best in the age-old fight that is parents raising young children. But the real me is hidden. I'm awesome. And one day you'll see it. And the real you is awesome too. And one day you will see it for yourself. And all of the brokenness, and all of the frailty, and all of the things that you wish weren't true about yourself, when Christ, who is your life, is revealed, you will be revealed in glory. Our destiny is tied up with the story of Jesus. Just as he is in heaven in a glorious resurrected body, so you and I have a destiny that is glorified humanity, transformed, more alive than ever before, body and soul in the presence of God, sharing in the glory of our ascended Lord. And so all of this means that to be a Christian is to walk, as the apostle says elsewhere, by faith and not by sight. We look around and we might see violence, greed, we might see the violent and the greedy and the immoral people getting ahead. We might see that lies and deception are just part of what it means to advance. We might see that money is what makes the world go round. And if you live by sight, then you'll buy into this pattern because it's how the world appears to work. But that's not true. And we know it's not true because Jesus rose bodily from the dead and took that renewed humanity into the glory of God to be seated at the right hand of the Father. And Jesus is kindness, compassion, humility, gentleness, and patience personified. He didn't do it with anger and wrath and malice and slander. He didn't do it with impurity. These things don't win, and there will come a day when these things will disappear, and all of that is because of Christ's ascension. There's a human being on the throne. He will return again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and when he comes, all of us who have put our trust in him will be like him also. I can invite the band to come on up. And just to conclude, I'm going to read a poem, a sonnet by an author named Malcolm Geet. You'll see it up on the screen. It might help you to be able to follow along with me, or it might just be easier if you want to listen to it. It just captures what's going on here with the story of Christ's ascension. We saw his light break through the cloud of glory, whilst we were rooted still in time and place. As earth became a part of heaven's story, and heaven opened to his human face. We saw him go, and yet we were not parted. He took us with him to the heart of things, the heart that broke for all the broken-hearted, is whole and heaven-centered now and sings. Sings in the strength that rises out of weakness, sings through the clouds that veil him from our sight, whilst we ourselves become his clouds of witness and sing the waning darkness into light. His light in us and ours in him concealed, which all creation waits to see revealed.